Hi everyone, welcome to our Module 11 class on the presidency. This is actually a really interesting topic because I think in a way it sort of points to, well, it ties up some of the debates we've been having so far this semester, but more importantly, I think it points to some of the real changes and issues that are working their way through the American political system right now. And for those of us concerned with things like domestic surveillance, various controversies to do with warrantless wiretapping, things like this, I think it's an interesting time to be looking at the presidency. We'll have more comments on some of the specifics actually when we come to do our week on foreign policy, but here we really just sort of want to speak to some of the conjecture that has led to where we are today and give a little narrative on the background of the president, some of the deep theoretical stuff, maybe you could say, related to our thinking about the presidency as an institution. Of course, we tend to sort of, especially in a country like America, but also elsewhere, to focus perhaps overly much on the personality, the integrity, the character of the president himself or herself. That's a mistake I want to argue to you in this class. I think what we want to focus on today is the presidency as an institution. And I'll make an argument to today about why that's so. The institution is not the person. The institution is much more complex than that. It's subject to a lot of structures, structural pressures, structural forces at work on it. We don't just elect the person and then that person has the total freedom to do what they want. In fact, the American political system will really bog a president down just by virtue of its nature. And the idea of a strong president is something that many Americans would sort of desire, but an equal number of Americans would probably be leery of having a strong president, and that is, in fact, perfectly in keeping with the tradition of the founders as well. Some of the founders, like Alexander Hamilton, believed that the presidency should be the most important branch of government because it's there that you find the major center of action, the center of power for achieving important goals. He said, energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. Today, because of a number of pressures on the presidency, the Federalist side, that is the side here represented by Alexander Hamilton, seems to be in ascendance. But we can say that in a way, the 20th century has been a transformative time for the presidency. It was there and then that the power of the presidency seemed to gain most prominently. And it's hard actually to say whether that was the result of elite pressures or popular democratic pressures. That's one argument that I'd really underline for you today. After all, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who used elitist means to introduce what we now know today as the New Deal. This is, of course, something that many people on the liberal left will associate with popular democracy. It's something that conservatives may lament, but it puts paid to the idea that elitist power is only ever used by the right. It here is clear that the FDR was advancing the cause of economic reform. Not to mention other potential movements for social justice, for example, he was using the powers of the presidency in a sort of elitist manner to advance popular democratic goals, which doesn't sound natural, I think, given the way we've been focusing on the idea of popular democratic forces is always and everywhere from below. But I think also it's important to recognize that outside of this whole elite and popular democratic set of pressures, the place of America in the world has changed. So naturally, the president, the country has had to be better suited, be better arranged to respond with just one voice to the crises that emerge along the way. America is now a world power. Congress doesn't speak with one voice, whereas the executive branch can. So at a time of international crisis, when you're a country that is a leading power, it's only natural, I think, that the country should shift in a way to become a more unitary type system. And later on, we will be speaking of the unitary executive, for better or for worse, because of course, it's not clear that this is in fact a good thing, but it is the way things are. The first thing we want to talk about today is the personalized presidency. The president's personality, as we were arguing in the introduction, is pretty much the thing most Americans focus on when it comes to, say, election time. But what real indicator are these strengths or capacities for the likely success of the president? After all, individuals who wield enormous power for change obviously do, their individual traits do matter, but to what extent does it make a difference who the actual president is? Americans and the American media, with its strong focus on idiosyncratic traits like Ronald Reagan and his jelly beans, Barack Obama and his basketball, George Bush and his preference for biking, Bill Clinton and his junk food. These are all sort of things that we focus on, but if you want to know the truth, it's probably a bit more complicated than these idiosyncratic traits. Your textbook cites a study by someone called James David Barber, and he breaks down the way of thinking about a president as an individual into two different sort of vectors or axes. One is the axis of the active-passive president in relation to the president's job. Active being someone who's very much involved. Passive is someone who's maybe not so involved. And then another axis, which is the positive-negative axis, in terms of how that president perceives their personal satisfaction in relation to the job. So what you want, says David Barber at the end of his study, is someone who's got, if you look on both those axes, then what you have is a sort of a preference, says Barber, for someone who's active and positive. That is to say, has a proactive stance towards their job and a good feeling about that job. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Carter, Bush Sr., these were all active, positive presidents on those two axes. But, of course, the axis has other potential outcomes. The worst type, says James David Barber, is the active negative. That is to say, someone who is active in the job, but motivated out of perhaps something like a lack of self-confidence, which can force that person or suggest that that person will, in terms of their individual psychology, be likely to double down on their mistakes. So, for example, Nixon just dug deeper and deeper into the hole and eventually got caught breaking the law and acting in an extremely, ill-judged manner vis-a-vis the obligations the presidency put on him. So these are sort of personality-focused arguments, but while clearly a successful presidency is dependent on personality, it's important also to look at the team, that's in place around the president, how that team is organized, the institutional dynamics through which that team is organized and deployed around the president. In that sense, the institution itself has its own dynamics outside of the psychology of the individual. So there are rules of the game, so to speak, that the president and the staff have to conform to. And so for that reason, in this class, we're going to be less interested in, whether George Bush was a good or a bad guy, or Obama's a good or a bad guy, and look more at the institution itself. Because I think our suspicion is, while psychology matters, even someone with the best of intentions and the best, sort of psychological readiness for the position isn't going to necessarily be able to overcome a strong set of institutional dynamics pushing back against them. There are these rules of the game after all. So we'll want to focus on that in the next few slides. Now, of course, just a little sort of insert here about Obama. He is the president at the moment, and he is a bit of a sort of a surprise president in some ways. Many expected Hillary Rodham Clinton to be the Democrats' pick way back in 2008. Obama was a relatively obscure figure for most Americans at the time. But Hillary had supported the war, and many say that because of this, Obama was able to find a sort of a chink in the armor, so to speak. And then because of his unique personal abilities as a communicator and a speech maker specifically, he was able to gain ascendancy and attention in the public's eye. He did have some apparent successes, but it must be said that he did not do so very well in his first term. For many, it was down to something like a kind of personal naivete. Now, your book says that he overestimated Republican willingness to make compromises. That is, he went into his first term believing in bipartisanship, and basically the Republicans didn't. But I think perhaps in some ways it might be more complicated than that. Ron Suskind, for example, who is a very well-known analyst of presidential politics in the popular press, argues that in fact Obama appointed a large number of bad advisors. For example, in terms of the economy, he appointed a lot of Goldman Sachs people, and frankly, they didn't do what they were told. Right? What they did in Suskind's term is they slow walked him. Right? That is to say, he told them what he wanted, breaking up Goldman Sachs, for example, and then a couple of months later, Timothy Geithner, people like this, hadn't come up with plans or strategies to carry out the president's request. So what Ron Suskind is arguing here is that Obama kind of got it in the neck from both sides, right? The Republicans, he was naive vis-a-vis the willingness of Republicans to work with him across the aisles. And he was naive about his ability to appoint Wall Street executives to important positions within his cabinet and within his staff, and they didn't do what he wanted them to do. So, if anything, then the first couple of years of Obama seemed to be one of not much getting done, and so in 2010, the Republicans made significant congressional gains. By 2011, I think Obama had realized that his approach, his optimistic, liberal kind of trusting in human nature style approach wasn't working, and he became, it is said at least, a bit more sharp. And coming into his third year in 2012, and the 2012 election, he seemed to be able to win the election, which was quite interesting, given that American candidates for presidency generally don't win when there's a high unemployment rate. Obama was able to accomplish this, which I think is quite significant. So moving on, the presidency as an institution, we want to talk about its staff. The structural organization of the executive staff was not outlined in any particular detail by the founding fathers. So a lot of this, as we talked about last week with Congress, much of it has had to be filled out as the country's changed and as history has progressed. The White House staff used not to be very big. I think, as your book documents, President Lincoln only had 2 real aides, whereas by the time FDR was in office in the years before World War II, it was quite apparent that, as the Brownlow Committee, which was a committee set up to look into this, argued at the time, the president needs a little help. So the staff of the White House started to grow in the context of the Great Depression. FDR had notions about using the office of the presidency to try to change how the economy was operating. And, due to sort of congressional inaction and the fact that the economy was not getting anywhere in a hurry in the Great Depression, FDR decided to step in and got legislation for congressional powers to be given to the office of the presidency in order to be able to carry out economic stimulus style activities. We'll come back to this later on in the lecture. But that was the start of an expansion of presidential staff in the White House. It didn't just stop with FDR, however. The high point was probably under Nixon, with 500 staff members. Since then, it's come down a little bit, but that was the high point. Now, of course, as the nature of the pressures and forces arranged, confronting the country, confronting its population have changed, so too the White House has had to respond. And we hinted at that a moment ago in reflecting on FDR's attitude to the Great Depression. So it wasn't just a question, then, is the point of the White House developing or acquiring new staff. It also acquired new functions. Prior to FDR, presidents used to turn to their cabinets, their ministers, if you want to use that phrase. That tends to be the term used in Europe, but those are parliamentary systems. So here we tend to talk about cabinet members. The question is, why would these functions? Why would FDR want these functions to be sort of in-house and not enshrined in the cabinet members that previous presidents had relied upon? And the answer to the question is that it is to do with the way the Senate regulates and controls the way presidential appointments to the cabinet are administered. The Senate can give advice and consent to those appointments. So the president, obviously, and we're seeing that pretty much every election cycle now, where senatorial appointments or cabinet appointments get held up in the Senate. So it's in the president's interest then to try to get those powers into the hands of his staffers and not get too hung up on what's going on with these congressional appointments to the cabinet. Another advantage is those staffers, once they're in place, they don't have to appear before congressional inquiries because of the separation of powers. They're considered the president's staff while he is in the office, and so they are not. They're not considered, public servants that can be subject to scrutiny by Congress. So all that to say, the president does have a lot of flexibility about what he can say and do with his staffers. But there are, of course, negatives here as well. The president, if he depends too much on staffers, might get out of touch with the real world. He might be too isolated from the real world. He's surrounding himself by, what some people might call yes men. They tell him what he wants to hear, and that's how he's going to end up seeing the world. So, having having some sort of dependency on cabinet, which again can be controlled by Congress, is important. Right now in the White House, we have the Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, who's pictured here. He's an important guy in the president's world. He has been seen to be someone who has been capable of a great deal of outreach towards Republican senators, having spent a long time already working in Congress in his career. That's been a priority for him, and it's said that Obama has depended on that quite a bit. Now, in this map, we get to see a little bit more of a broader snapshot of how the president's White House staff are located relative to the president in the context of the wider what's called executive office of the president, or the EOP. So the White House office, as you can see, is just part of the wider executive office. This is a body that was established in 1939, an institutional arrangement that was established in 1989, and it contains a lot of things that you hear about in the news. When you're following the news, you'll hear of things like the National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Council of Economic Advisors, of course. The Office of Management and Budget is hugely important to the president. It prepares the annual budget for the executive office, which the president has to present to Congress. The Council of Economic Advisors is also in this office. This was established in 1946 after World War II to allow the president to have input from professional economists and economic advisors, and these play a role in authoring the president's annual economic report and State of the Union address. And then we also have the National Security Council, just to name a handful of these offices established after World War II, also 1947. As Americans were waking up to their new status as a world power, again, we'll return to this later, the president wanted to have a body of advisors at his disposal to give him input on what was going on in the world. Now, in terms of criticism, the executive office of the president has shown that it can be, on occasion, politicized, advising the president poorly, for example, as Ronald Reagan found out during the Iran-Contra affair, where things were going on in his office, which he subsequently claimed no knowledge of, but were clearly engaged in policy making and implementation, whereas in theory their capacity is supposed to be simply as advisors to the president. So just furthering along, another important office that we should talk about here, on this slide we're going to talk about the vice president, but we'll also talk about cabinet, and we'll have some consideration for managing the bureaucracy. For most of the history of the presidency, vice presidents were fairly obscure figures. They were not really seen as major players in American politics. As burdens placed on the presidency multiplied, however, due to changing global dynamics, international relations pressures, globalization, the end of World War II, and America's emergence as a global power, contemporary chief executives have come to realize that the vice president is an important person and potentially very useful, providing valuable assistance, but also a good emissary for important overseas projects and missions. The first vice president to play a significant role in this sense was Walter Mondale, who brought years of Senate experience to bear in helping Jimmy Carter, who was actually more or less a Washington, D.C. outsider. to show him the ropes, so to speak. So that's our first sort of modern vice president. Later, we see a very important vice president in the shape of Al Gore, who was a major force intellectually and a major partner for Clinton, right up until the end, where Gore decided to run in 2000. They were very close, and of course, famously, Gore asked Clinton not to campaign for him in the aftermath of things like the Monica Lewinsky scandal and that type of thing. Gore thought that Clinton would be a sort of ball and chain. Another preeminent figure as a vice president is, of course, Dick Cheney, who was seen to be a very sort of upfront and powerful figure in terms of setting the presidential agenda, in terms of foreign policy. He was a neoconservative and had very sort of dark views on how the world was looking for American power. Many people attribute a lot of the things like the use of torture during the Bush administration to Dick Cheney, and hence he became known as Darth Vader. Turning now to the most recent vice president, which is Joe Biden. He's an interesting guy. He's kind of got he's sort of seen sometimes in the public eye as something to quote The Onion, which recently ran a piece on him, humorously referring to him as a creepy aging swinger uncle from the 1980s. So he has not been nearly as upfront or in the public eye as Dick Cheney. But that said, according to many experts, he has been seen to be an important voice and certainly a very important actor in terms of going overseas and facilitating business meetings for Obama overseas where the president cannot actually go and attend himself. So leaving the vice presidency aside, now let's talk about the cabinet. Now, just to sort of contrast with other countries, the president's cabinet, it's important to note, is composed of appointed heads of the principal executive agencies, which we looked at on the previous slide, plus a few others, such as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. In other countries, the cabinet is composed of elected parliamentarians, and they're often a good bit more powerful than American cabinet members. Presidents tend to have what's called an inner cabinet that is going to be composed of people like the Secretary of State, Defense, Treasury, along with the Attorney General. And these are kind of like priority kind of positions that have a lot of power generally and historically associated with them. These cabinet secretaries handle subjects, portfolios that are most important to the president, and they can be quite controversial, of course, because people like John Ashcroft, who had specific views on the Constitution during the Bush administration, was very instrumental in terms of establishing the interpretation of the, for example, authorization of use of military force after 9/11. We'll get back to that later in the lecture. Then, of course, there's the outer cabinet, which contains the remainder of the departments. People we will find here include the secretaries for agriculture, education, transportation, and generally the business of these departments is more sort of bureaucratic, quotidian, and not so necessarily central to the everyday business of the president. So the president obviously then has a huge bureaucracy at his disposal. How does he control it? Well, the cabinet members are going to be instrumental here. But what if the president has a cabinet member who doesn't want to do or won't do what the president wants, or whether there's bureaucracy members who won't do what the president wants? The president has a difficult time sometimes with the bureaucracy. It's very large, so that's one limitation. It's just hard to envision and organize and administer. But the solution that has come in the shape of what's called the executive order. It doesn't help the president in every single regard. I mean, the president doesn't have a huge amount of power over permanent government. Actual civil servants that work for, say, the Department of Education, the president doesn't have any role in hiring or firing those people. So what power can he deploy to get them to line up and do his bidding? After all, he's the executive. Well, the tool here is what's called the executive order, which is a presidential directive to subordinates in the executive branch, and it carries actually the force of law. So that means that the president, he doesn't want to use this every day, of course, because that's micromanaging and it would be bad for morale. But if something happened that the president wasn't getting his way on, or needed to clarify a specific piece of legislation, for example, Obama used the executive order during his administration to repeal the "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" order that had been given by Clinton vis-a-vis homosexual servicemen in the military. Obama was able to issue an executive order that repealed that effectively and made that illegal. So now let's talk about the presidency and Congress. I think most Americans would perceive that there's a problem between the presidency and Congress. They don't get along very well, and that's historic. It can be frustrating, but it might surprise you to know that the framers did actually kind of intend it to be that way. It's all part of the idea of a division of powers to prevent any one power from becoming too powerful. The famous quote here by Madison, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition," encapsulates this perfectly. What the founders wanted was that these entities would sort of keep each other in check. Now, that's not to say, once we've thought about that one side is on the side of the elites and the other side is sort of more democratic. Congress is, of course, necessarily a bit more in touch. Congress members are generally a bit more in touch with their constituents than the federal president would be. But that's not to say, historically speaking, that the institutions have always performed according to expectations. The irony in terms of our framework that we've used is that in fact some of the most progressive, popular democratic actors in American government have been people like Kennedy, Johnson, whereas Nixon and Ford have been more generally elitist in their use of the presidency. So we would do well to try to avoid necessarily bracketing the president, the institution and the office of the presidency as inherently elitist. And that despite the fact that people like Hamilton, as we cited at the beginning of the lecture, clearly had a view that the presidency was an important elite institution. But as we were saying, definitely there is a history of not getting along between Congress and the office of the presidency. There's conflict between the two bodies. And perhaps the most important source of that conflict is the fact that congressmen are frequently elected in their districts and have to be re-elected in their districts. So Congress, as we discussed last week, congressmen are in a permanent campaign. And so they really do have a different constituency and a different relationship to their constituency than the president. To keep their jobs, they have to keep their voters happy. And those voters are not necessarily backers of the president. And if they were when the president was elected, they might not be now. So we need to think about that fact, the constraint that Congress puts just by virtue of the fact of the way it has to operate. But another a factor, of course, is the fact that sometimes you're going to have a party in Congress that's from a different party than the president. Or, in fact, it might control Congress or it might control both houses. And if that's the case, it's going to have a significant impact on the president's prospects for obtaining passage of his legislation. In recent years, the institutional context of divided control between parties has been, of course, characterized by extreme polarization. If a Democratic president is in office, the Republicans tend to be very acrimonious in their relationship with the president. So that makes it harder of late. That all said, even if you have perfect cohabitation, even if you have perfect alignment, and that it's a Republican president and Republican houses, or vice versa for the Democrats, that can still be tricky because, of course, the other judge in the equation is these opinion polls, and that's something Bill Clinton found out in the first 2 years he was in office, even though he had a unified government. So what sort of resources then, we can ask, can the president deploy to try to help him improve his relationship with Congress and increase the likelihood that his legislative preferences will be approved by Congress? Well, 3 things here on the slide: agenda, mystique, and vetoes. The president has a power to set the White House legislative program, and of course he announces that every year at the State of the Union address. This is a tradition, in fact, going back to the old parliamentary systems of Europe. The Queen's address to the British Parliament is very much in the same vein. And if the president establishes a strong, well-timed agenda that's clear, then I guess he has the power to by virtue of the fact that he's a very major public figure, that Congress will have to respond to that and say, okay, or no, we'd rather not. And the president can harangue them to make that happen. So another way the president can act, especially to get his State of the Union address taken seriously, is to play on his mystique. Right, he's a powerful figure. He's a famous figure. He has a lot of limelight, and to be seen to be a friend of the president, to be seen to be allied with the president, can give someone a lot of spotlight time. So, in this sense, the president can boost a representative standing with the constituents. The president can go on the stump with the constituent at a time of election or re-election. So that is a power the president can sort of use to get his way as well. Because if I do you a favor, well, you have to do me a favor right in return. And if all else fails and the president does not get any of the legislation he wants, then he can, as a final weapon, just use the veto, and he can veto everything that comes his way. Of course, they're considered to be rather draconian instruments, but it must be said that the president needs to use it from time to time. The president can also, and this is mentioned in the book, but I wanted to mention it again with you here and give a little more detail. The president can also use signing statements when he approves something that Congress sends his way. He can issue a signing statement when the bill is signed into law. It's basically a technique that's employed by a president to say that certain provisions of the bill, that he's interpreting them a certain way. So Congress writes the legislation, but then the president can say, okay, that's what you've written, but here's how I'm interpreting it. And it might not be the same interpretation that Congress has. And you can see historically how this technique has become a little bit more prevalent in recent times. In fact, until Ronald Reagan was president, in the entire history of the country, there were only ever 75 signing statements signed by presidents. But from Reagan until the end of the Clinton administration, that number skyrocketed, and we had 247 signing statements over the course of those three presidencies, which are going to be 20 years almost. So within 20 years, a tripling effectively of presidential signing statements. Well, by the end of 2008, George W. Bush Jr., how many had he signed? He had signed 157. That's a stunning number for just 8 years, and shows, just a huge reliance and dependence on signing statements by presidents. And we have to ask ourselves the question, why is that going on? I think for George Bush, clearly it had something to do with fighting the war on terror and his desire to assert himself as a very powerful president relative to the powers of Congress. Now, the presidency and economic power largely comes to us in the context of the Employment Act in 1946, which speaks of the duty of the president to foster and promote free competitive enterprise, to avoid economic fluctuations or to diminish the effects thereof, and to maintain employment, production, and purchasing power. Right, so the thing is, before the New Deal, FDR's New Deal, presidents seldom tried to affect overall economic conditions. They just weren't that much involved in it, and that became a huge problem then during the Great Depression, because the Great Depression happened due to a very lax attitude by Congress towards regulating the economy. And FDR at the time believed that Congress wouldn't act, and history, I think, would suggest he was right. So he asserted that this economic management should be partially the responsibility of the presidency. His role became a legal responsibility, in fact, for him and for every president after him, thanks to the Employment Act of 1946, which is a major game changer in the powers of the presidency and also in American economic history, it must be said. It gave the federal government, and especially the president, the duty that we see here listed in the screen, to promote enterprise, to keep the economy on an even keel, avoid those fluctuations, and to make sure that production and employment are taking place. So the president has power to pursue these goals, and he does it, of course, through the use of what's called fiscal and monetary policy. Now, this is not an economics class, and I'm not going to pretend to take time to explain fiscal policy and monetary policy to you today, but I can explain them very, very simply, I suppose, and briefly. Fiscal policy generally involves either taxation or spending money in the economy to affect economic conditions, right? And the theory here, of course, comes from the time of the Great Depression, which is where people like John Maynard Keynes, famous economists like that, were arguing that effectively, if the economy had collapsed and private enterprise was not spending any money in the economy and goods and services were not being consumed in the economy, in other words, people weren't going to the shops because they had no money, one thing the government could do would be to step into the economy and become a buyer of last resort, so to speak. And that's exactly what fiscal policy speaks to, the ability of government to be an actor in the economy and to change economic conditions in that sense. We can talk a little bit more about that later in the semester when it comes to economic policy. We already have talked about it at the very start of the semester in terms of our discussion about economy then. The other type of policy is monetary policy, of course. If fiscal policy is more to do with taxing and spending, monetary policy is to do with what the central bank does. In America, that's called a Federal Reserve. And it's to do with how we set interest rates and how much money we're printing at any given time. That can also be a major factor, because if there's a lot of money being pumped into the economy by the Federal Reserve due to, for example, low interest rates, or printing of money. It can obviously change the amount of goods and services that are being pursued relative to the size of the amount of cash circulating. So it can do interesting things like change inflation rates, which can be very important in times of a financial crisis as well. One other thing that's very important to mention is the fact that the economy is also very much influenced by the actions of some of the major players within it. And the state is not the only one that acts in the economy, of course, both fiscally or monetarily. The president has to contend also with the power of the corporate sector, its power over media, its power over advertising, its power, legally speaking, gives it a certain sort of structural influence in the economy. So it has a decisive role, we can say, in determining the amount of, the direction of legislative efforts and initiatives in the United States. Some presidents, it must be said, have got along very well with the corporate sector, although investment decisions are made largely on economic grounds. Spokespersons for big business like to attribute lagging investment to the ability of the president to develop what they call business confidence. And when you hear the term business confidence, your ears should pick up a little bit when you hear that in a news story, because generally it's referring to chambers of commerce and this kind of thing, lambasting the president for his ability to stimulate a sense of optimism in the economy or not. Republican presidents generally have a better time with the corporate sector in this regards. They have, of course, generally roots in the elite, and therefore they have roots in the corporate world. Democrats have a harder time, a rockier relationship. Because of this, Democrats are sometimes known to go out of their way to be seen to appease big businesses. For example, Bill Clinton adopted support for free trade and financial deregulation, but the business community, sadly for him, didn't really want to return too much of that support. So an unfortunate chapter for him. So we've just talked about economic power, and now we want to talk about the presidency and national security. And I'm encompassing within this both the ability to make foreign policy and the ability to declare and make and wage war. And those are different things, by the way. Foreign policy is not at all necessarily related to making war or waging war or even security, although it can be, and it often is, and it leads to great confusion, I think, in people's minds, because the framers definitely separated those two powers, right? They gave the president the power as a kind of a chief ambassador or chief overseas figure in terms of the country's interactions with other countries in the world, right? So that's clearly is a power of foreign policy making that the president has. But over time, we've seen that power affirmed by the Supreme Court. Curtis Wright Corporation case of 1936, for example, which pertained to the sale of bombers and fighter planes to Bolivia, believe it or not. The United States did not want these bombers and fighter planes being sold to Bolivia for international relations reasons. And the president won the case, and so it sort of decided for once and for all the president has the ability to kind of set the agenda and implement that agenda vis-a-vis foreign policy, not Congress. On the military side of affairs, however, it's very, very clear that the framers have always given the president the power in terms of, the Congress the power in terms of declaring war. So believing that giving the power to make that decision to a single individual was a problem, because it would be dangerous, the framers of the Constitution gave that power to Congress, to the assembled representatives of the people. The president was to be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, of course. If Congress did declare war, or say there was a need for armed hostilities with someone, the president would be the one that would design the plans and implement those plans in collaboration with the armed forces. Historically, though, it's been very hard to keep the president confined within that secondary role. Because if Congress, is recalcitrant and doesn't give the president the wars he may deem to be necessary, he may find ways to go ahead and pursue them without congressional approval. So the president has been known to use military force, to authorize military force where there's what's called sometimes a clear and present danger. That can be to American property abroad. It can be to fight, for example, a small-scale war, or to allocate advisors to fight a small-scale war. Now, President Nixon, it clearly, and I think this is the historical record at this stage, abused this power in the era of the Vietnam War by extending the war legally into Cambodia without congressional approval. And that is something that triggered a major review on Congress's part of how things were being done. And so they bypassed Nixon's veto by signing into office, or signing into power into legislation, that is, the War Powers Resolution of 1973. According to this resolution, the president must, if circumstances permit, consult with Congress before sending American forces into a situation where armed conflict is anticipated. So this gives Congress basically power to tell the president, no, you cannot go to war. And the president has only, I think, a very short amount of days to go to Congress and get that approval, 90 days or something. If he doesn't have time and action is required urgently, he may go ahead and do so. But retroactively, that approval has to be gained from Congress, I think, within 3 months. So the executives do, have that constraint. The problem is that Congress hasn't really been very motivated to enforce that law since 1973. So, and I think you can see that especially in the way legislation has been passed after 9/11, because while the War Powers Resolution does contain within it a sort of an implicit recognition of the potential for abuse of the presidential power to make war. After 9/11, we had the authorization for use of military force, where Congress pretty much gave the president unlimited powers of war in order to retaliate and respond to the events of 9/11 and to complete and achieve victory in the war in terror. That's something actually Obama has maintained since Bush. So, foreign policy-wise, many people say there's not that much difference between Obama and Bush. And I think when you look at it from this perspective, that's very much true. Why don't we, in the next couple of slides, go into a little more detail on some of these things, because I think they'll be interesting for you. The point just here simply to make is that the people like Madison, Hamilton, did see war as kind of a corrupter of the executive branch. There's some great quotes here on the screen. Of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. And that's from Madison. He's your archetypal elite Democrat, and he's saying, that wars basically are the source of too much elitism and elite corruption in a democracy. He also says, in war, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices is multiplied, right? Not just, in other words, not just a legal power to declare war and wage war, but to sign contracts, for example, in terms of buying new equipment to go to war, right? So obviously there's going to be potential there for corruption and kickbacks as people are going to try to sell their technologies of war, their machineries of war to the country, so that it can win. And some of those technologies are obviously going to be quite good and necessary to win a war. But others might be, just people trying to cash in on the war profiteering. This is something George Washington was concerned about, as was President Eisenhower. So this is Madison's complaint that war is the true nurse of executive aggrandizement and corruption. So Madison, Washington, Eisenhower, we've named them, all of these presidents have expressed views that war is a corrupter of the executive branch. Many critics believe that this is in fact a serious issue with the Bush administration, and it's perhaps becoming apparent under Obama too. Late in 2005, it emerged that the National Security Agency had been spying on U.S. citizens. They had been acting without a warrant. And a warrant is required according to the Foreign Intelligence Security Act of 1978. A warrant is required. But as we've been arguing, the president believes that he has authority. The New York Times argued that this was an unusually expansive interpretation of the president's authority. And in the next couple of slides, I want to explore this with you because we've had our warnings here from Madison, Washington, Eisenhower, that there's a potential for corruption in the executive branch. I've spoken of this sort of financial aspect of it, which is what I suppose Washington was most concerned with. But Madison, I think, perhaps also concerned here that it's what we might call just simply a slippery slope argument. Once a president feels he has power, once he believes he sort of has a sort of a military power, then a lot of problems in the world start to look like military problems, right? There's an old phrase that when you're a sledgehammer, every problem looks like a nut, right? This is part of the logic. I think that there's a kind of an inadvertent aspect of it as well as an overt aspect to it. In this slide, we just have some information about the AUMF, which is the Authorization for Use of Military Force. Following the 9/11 attacks, Congress passed the Authorization for Use of Military Force, and it is an act that authorized the president, and I quote here, to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. And the key language here, I suppose, is all necessary force, right? Use all necessary and appropriate force. It seems to give the president kind of a carte blanche against any actor that he determines to be the enemy. So Congress is allowing him to decide who the friend is and who the foe is. And I suppose the question we would have to ask is there anything that this does not allow the president to do? To answer that question, we have to turn to a controversial figure, but a figure that has really sort of cast a long shadow over the historical reputation of the Bush administration, and his name is John Yoo. We'll turn to him now. Now, here we talk about the Yoo Doctrine. John Yoo was assistant to Attorney General Alberto Gonzales from 2001 to 2003. He was a well-known professor of law at University of California, Berkeley. Best known for his work, however, with Alberto Gonzalez as an assistant. He wrote memos, and it was revealed that he authored the memos especially pertaining to torture and habeas corpus, and that in these memos that he wrote, he defined terms very narrowly indeed, drawing from the Authorization for Use of Military Force, the AUMF or AUMF, and Article 2 of the Constitution, which gives the President war powers. John Yoo argued that the War on Terror in fact introduced a whole new legal era for the United States. So on September 25th, 2001, he wrote a memo which states that no statute passed by Congress could place any limits on the president's potential or power to rule over who was a terrorist and who was not a terrorist, or the amount of military force to be used in response to that person. So this is the basis of what many people call unitary executive theory, that in a time of war, the commander-in-chief pretty much has unchecked power. Now, Congress, of course, had in the AUMF given the president that power, but there's also the term or the word in there, if you remember, appropriate. And this is the question that many critics have had now in response. Now, Congress hasn't really taken that power back yet. But when we think about the word appropriate, it might be helpful for us to think about a debate that John Yoo had with a law professor by the name of Doug Castle in 2005, where they debated precisely this term. You know, what is the limit of the president's power if this word appropriate is being used? Castle argues, and I quote, "If the president deems that he's got to torture somebody, including by crushing the testicles of that person's child, there is no law that can stop him," he asks Yoo. And Yoo says there's no treaty. And Castle says also no law by Congress. That's what Yoo wrote in the August 2002 memo. And John Yoo responds, "I think it depends on why the president thinks he needs to do that." So that's an interesting point, right? I think it depends on why the president thinks he needs to do that. In other words, if the president feels that it's to do with the war on terror, then sure. So we're going to sort of take from this our cue, if you will, to reflect on presidential power in terms of foreign policy and war making in the context of the war on terror. And we'll have a whole class on this before the end of semester when we look at foreign policy. I'm going to specifically look in that class, not so much at torture, although I look a little bit at that, of course, but I just want to focus specifically on issues like domestic wiretapping. I want to talk about Bradley Manning. I want to talk about WikiLeaks and things like this. And so we'll come back to that. I think it's week 14, I believe. We do that. So in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. And I'll look forward to meeting you and talking with you about that, okay? So that's it for the end of today, guys. Thanks very much for your time, and I will see you in class on Thursday. Be good.